Today I will just present what is my current research interest and has been the same for many, many years. And it's really about the principles behind the Adam style that we all know. And this is a very exciting period for Adam studies because there's a renewed interest in Robert Adam. I've been asked to introduce this book, a bit of publicity. So there will be a new book which results from a conference that was held 2 years ago, edited by Colin Tom on the Adam brothers, and I'm contributing to this book. And the Georgian Society has contributed to the pictures, so we're very grateful. And also, this is the first public occasion in which we can announce that finally we are in a position to create and produce the critical edition of the Adam papers at Edinburgh, which have been scanned as we speak in Edinburgh at the moment. So they will be out in a few years, hopefully. My real interest is in the principles, sources, and overall modus operandi behind the sheer variety of the Adam style as we know. So I'm really interested in focusing on a few essential principles, and you will see that today I will focus on the few sources, few concepts that actually justified and supported these incredible variety of the Adam interiors especially. We all know Robert Adam. Of course, he was one of the greatest architects of the 18th century, of the last part of the 18th century, part of a well-established family of architects, Scottish architects, born and bred in Edinburgh and trained under his father William. In 1754, he left for Rome on his grand tour, and he remained until 1758, while his brother then, from 1760 to 1763, went to Rome. So the Adam brothers actually went to Rome between 1754 and 1763. This is a momentous moment in the career of Robert Adam because the exposure to the context and milieu and environment, the cultural environment of Rome in the 1750s is not only paramount in the formation of Robert Adam's modus operandi, but it's really paramount and essential in understanding the formation of neoclassicism. Rome in the 1750s is the Academy of Europe. This is a wonderful map by Giovan Battista Nolli, published in 1748, almost the same year of the great London rock map. It's a great period for map making, this. And Rome in the 1750s is still the great destination of not only of grand tour travelers, but especially of artists and architects who wanted to round off their education in the presence of the antique. Rome is the seat of the great Roman Academy of San Luca, of the French Academy in Rome, is the place where the new Capitoline Museum, where you could study at first hand classical antiquities, had been just reopened, is the place where in 1755, when Adam is there, Joachim Winckelmann arrives in Rome and becomes the librarian of the great collector, the Cardinal Albani, who opens up his Villa Albani for the connoisseurs, the artists, and the architects. And especially is also the period in which Giovanni Battista Piranesi, the great engraver and architect, more an engraver and an antiquarian than an architect, as we all know, the genius engraver and assembler of Roman antiquities, started to publish his famous antiquarian publication, especially the Antiquità Romana. Adam trained under a French draftsman called Clérisseau, but the influence of Giovanni Battista Piranesi and his conception of classical antiquity is immense, and we cannot understand the mentality and the overall ethos of Adam's relationship to classical antiquity without the influence of Piranesi, who had a relationship with Roman antiquity based on a principle, what I call a principle of citation. Constant citation of prototypes and models from classical Rome, rather than a thorough penetration of the classicistic principles of classical architecture. The relationship between the two men was very intense at the beginning, and then with heights and lows throughout their career, but of course their friendship and mutual esteem was sanctioned then by the great map of the Campus Martius, the great re-evocation of the ancient Campus Martius, based on magnificence and antiquarian evocation rather than specific philology. This map is completely wrong, of course. But what counts, what is really interesting for us today is that in the tablet here, this is dedicated by Piranesi to Robert Adam. Robert Adam Britanno, Iconographia in Campi Marzi dedicatam, and the two men appear side by side as classical architects in the Clypeus that is on the upper part. Piranesi is mostly, with Clérisseau, responsible for the beginning of what will become the foundation, the essential repertoire behind the Adam style and behind the late Georgian architecture, especially the interiors, which is this obsessive, almost compulsive, obsessive accumulation of printed sources. Adam, since the beginning, since 1754, starts to assemble an enormous museum on paper in his workshop in Rome. Gems, coins, reliefs, grotesque decorations, sarcophagi, ceilings, full-size sculpture, all details from classical Rome. In all different medias, he had an army of draftsmen who worked for him because he understood that only through an accumulation of visual, and this is the point, visual, pictorial material, he would have been the most successful architect once he would have come back to London in 1758. Not only drawing, but also a huge collection of prints. We are talking about thousands and thousands and thousands of items. We are still today, almost all of them, not all of them, but almost all of them gather at the Sir John Museum in London because they were acquired, of course, in the 1818 and other sales by Syon. Adam, in a moment of enlightenment in 1755, after having had dinner with Piranesi, and this emerges from the letters at Edinburgh, he rushed out of the tavern when they were having dinner and wrote to his brother in London that his mission in the future would have been to outdo Chambers in figures, in bas-reliefs, and in ornaments. William Chambers, of course, who had been in Rome before him and who will become, of course, the other great late Georgian architect, the direct competitor of Robert Adam. Adam understood immediately that Chambers was better than him in architecture, and this is in the letters. And so he understood that actually if he wanted to become even more successful than Chambers, he had to propose something radically alternative and base his office and his firm on citations of figures, bas-reliefs, and ornaments. So the ornamental apparatus, plaster reliefs, grisaille, roundels, etc., would have been the source of his success. And in fact, retrospectively, in his works in architecture, the ever self-promoting Adam, he was a very clever businessman. He wrote that actually the real novelty of his style, the real great revolution of his style, was to have introduced the true style of antique decoration through a careful search into the purest sources of antiquity, which of course is not true because the Adam sources are very often eclectic rather than referring to the purest sources of antiquity. But it's very symptomatic the fact that actually he based the essential principles of his stylistic and architectural revolution on this principle of citation of antique sources. And allow me a digression on more general aspects of the Adam style. Adam is not interested in one of the essential principles, if not the essential principle of classicism, at least classicism as intended by the Roman and Parisian Academy. Adam is not interested in proportional consistency. The architecture of Adam doesn't try to create a whole via the harmonic relationship of the single parts through ratio and overall mathematical proportion. This is not what Adam is interested in. Adam is interested in contrast, in movement. Adam is interested in the overall effect, what he calls the picturesque, which is based on this sheer juxtaposition of different citation. So the architecture of Adam is not really an architecture that appeals to the intellect as the purest classicistic version of architecture would. Is an architecture that appeals to the senses, and in fact this is the great age of Hume, not surprisingly. A personal friend of Adam and his family. It's an architecture that appeals especially to the eye, but also to memory, through this principle of citations, this collection of citations that would have been very, very familiar to all his patrons who had been to Rome. So if, so to speak, the emblem and attribute of the classicistic architect is the compass through which you measure the overall logic and the overall mathematical accuracy of proportion, the emblem of Adam should be a pair of scissors, because he cuts and pastes sources from classical antiquity, and what he is really interested in is the theatrical pictorial effect eventually. So paradoxically, from this point of view, Adam is truly anti-classical. And in fact, he opens up, in a way, a relationship to classical antiquity. He heralds a relationship to classical antiquity, which will become much more familiar in the 19th century, based on the appropriation of forms rather than principles. If Bramante, if Inigo Jones, if Lord Burlington, and certainly if the arch-orthodox Logier would have entered an Adam interior, they would have been certainly puzzled, if not horrified. And it's exactly this visual galaxy of reference that is what interests me, and also the way he plays with proportions in a theatrical way, appealing to the senses rather than to the intellect. So today I will focus just to show you how this principle of quotation, reassembled in a theatrical, sensorial way, takes shape. I will focus on only one building by Robert Adam, which is Syon House, the great Syon House, the house of the first Duke and Duchess of Northumberland, at that time just Earl and Countess of Northumberland, in the county of what was the county of Middlesex. This is one of the earliest grand interiors of Adam, and hence is one of the places where you can see his modus operandi and the future trajectories of his style. It's a laboratory to understand the Adam style. So the exterior of the house was left almost untouched, in my opinion, to stress the historical presence of the family in the county of Middlesex. This was a monastery and then turned in the 16th century into a country house, and this is a Jacobean, early 17th century aspect, although completely restored in the 18th and 19th century. But in the interiors, Adam had carte blanche, constantly directed by the first Duke of Northumberland, who was a gentleman architect, an amateur architect, and controlled the execution. So also the first Duke of Northumberland is really behind the formation of some of the essential characteristics of the Adam style. As you can see immediately by the juxtaposition of these two rooms, this is the very stern, Doric, severe Vitruvian hall, based on, more or less, on the description of Vitruvius' atrium. And immediately after you have the anteroom, which is in a way, under many aspects, an evocation of the vestibulum as described by Vitruvius. As you can see, these rooms, so the hall, the Doric hall, leads into the vestibule. There couldn't be two more different rooms in terms of visual impact, and in terms of proportion, and in terms of overall design. This is exactly what Adam wanted in order to promote a new product that was exciting and new compared to what the previous late Palladian generation could provide. The only overall principle unifying the rooms is the progression of the orders. You go from Doric to Ionic to Corinthian to Composite. So this principle of quotation, and I will show you only two rooms, so the vestibule and the long gallery, works on several levels, and they're all intertwined. And you have many different levels, but I will focus mainly on three. One is a quotation and citation of Roman architectural sources. Then you have citation of statues, full-size statues that they would have seen in Rome. Third, you have an overall system of citation of ornamental sources, sarcophagi, reliefs, gems, and coins, all of them intertwined. If very often this could be played and declined in a very ornamental way, Adam could also provide something much more complex at times. If the patron was educated enough and had enough money, he could provide not only ornamental beauty, but he could provide also iconographical consistency. So Adam very often is just being considered as a great decorator. But actually he knew his sources very, very well. He'd been in Rome, he'd seen how these had been reassembled in great collections of the cardinals, etc., etc. He knew the language on which to reassemble visual sources and visual subjects pertaining to classical antiquity. So the first one is the architectural quotation. The first citation is obviously architectural, and Syon is really a collection, a sort of like garland of different pearls. You have all different types of buildings within one interior, and this is one of the most fascinating aspects of the early Adam interiors. If the hall is mainly based on the Roman basilica or the frigidarium of a Roman bath, the vestibule is completely devoted to the triumphal arch and especially the Arch of Constantine. Not directly, the reference is not only directly to the Arch of Constantine, whose elevation is repeated on the four walls, but especially to a series of prints depicting the Arch of Constantine. This is the Godet, the Antiquity of Rome, so one of the most famous books that Adam had wished to update, not only to the original source that all the patrons and the educated visitors would have recognized while stepping inside this room, not only the original Arch of Constantine, but also exactly this sort of like paper museum that all the European Republic of Letters would have recognized. So the reference is both to the original source and to this galaxy of paper references. Most of these antiquarian publications, not surprisingly, are in the library of Robert Adam. We have an inventory. And also in the libraries of most of his patrons. Not surprisingly, all of them appear in the library of Syon House. So it's literally a game of recognition for the educated elite. Not surprisingly, the Duke of Northumberland is one of the founding members of the Society of Dilettanti. He was member of the Society of Antiquaries, is one of the first trustees of the British Museum. So he knew perfectly the antiquarian publications, and he knew perfectly what was the language that Adam was intending to use. Second level, you see already here, and there are many, many, many at Syon House, quotation and citations from classical statuary, full-size statuary in the round that they would have seen in Rome. Remember that the first and foremost, the reason why everybody went to Rome was not only to copy classical architecture, but first and foremost was to experience and copy and familiarize with the great statuary that you could see in the Belvedere courtyard, in the Capitoline, in the Borghese, Farnese, Giustiniani collection, etc., etc. This is a wonderful, extraordinary bronze replica of the Dying Gaul, the original of which was and still is exactly in the same position in the Capitoline Museum. One of the most expensive bronze replicas of the 18th century by Luigi Valadier, one of the great goldsmiths, shipped then based on a wish of Adam and the Duke to Syon House. Also in this case, the overall selection of the statues to be displayed in the different rooms is not only based on memory, but of course is based on many different sources, but especially this one, which is the Raccolta di Statue Antiche e Moderne by Maffei de Rossi, published in 1704, which became literally the blue guide of classical statuary for anyone who wanted to remember this canon of classical statues once back in England, in Prussia, in Denmark, or in Russia. This is a language that step by step became a common pan-European shared language from St. Petersburg to Lisbon to the east coast of the United States of America. The selection of most of the statues at Syon House is based on the Maffei de Rossi, where they engrave and illustrate, of course, the Dying Gaul and most of the other statues in the house. Architecture, full-size sculpture, decoration. The decorative apparatus, as you know, is really what Adam thinks that is making his style completely different from what came before. So this overall assemblage of reliefs, plaster reliefs, painted ceiling, grisailles in roundels, etc., etc., etc. Also, in this case, they all come more than original drawings on printed sources. If you go around Syon House, and this is just a random selection of images of Syon, they're all based on antiquarian publications, and the execution is completely different, from painting to plaster to this is a new marble paste by Wilton, to grisaille, to marble, etc., etc. But the foundation and the source is the same. Antiquarian publication, and first and foremost, this book by the great antiquarian and art historian of the 17th century, Giovanni Pietro Bellori, one of the great leaders of the Roman Academy, and by his engraver Pietro Santi Bartoli. This book, the Admiranda Romanarum Antiquitatum, which was published in 1693, is the book of reference for Roman reliefs, Roman sarcophagi, and even paintings, so narrative scenes from classical antiquity. Is a publication that if you look around libraries in country house all over England still today, if you look at the database of the National Trust and if you put Admiranda, you will see how many libraries owned and still own the Admiranda. Not to mention the Royal Academy, the Society of Antiquaries. This is a book that actually was shared among all the academies and the collectors of the 18th century. With the Admiranda, you can really go around Adam interiors and have a key to understand not only the formal borrowings but also the iconographical borrowing, because what is exceptional of this book is that not only you have images that could easily reuse the ones back in England of famous reliefs that you had seen in Rome, but Bellori conveniently provided also the iconographical interpretation of the subject. So if you wanted to recreate a decorative cycle with a consistent iconographical approach, you would have used the subjects described by Adam. If you want to create a dining room devoted to Bacchus, Ceres, and Venus, you would have selected, in the best cases, you would have selected the plates of the Admiranda referring to that. So I will show you now only one room we've seen so far at Syon. This is the map, the plan of Syon published in the Works in Architecture. I just showed you the hall and the vestibule. We'll skip the next two rooms and we will focus on the long gallery, and this is the last room, and then I will conclude. The long gallery is a very narrow and long space. As you can see, this was the original Jacobean long gallery of the house. Each of the rooms of Syon is a basilica, a triumphal arch, a frigidarium, and then the last one was devised on the suggestion of Horace Walpole, or at least if we believe Horace Walpole. We should not always take what he says for granted. But if we believe Horace Walpole, he suggested to the Duke and Adam to turn in this long space into a Roman columbarium, so a Roman tomb. And probably this was the only way to deal with a room like this, as any other Georgian architect would have divided this room into smaller spaces. Very difficult to handle, very difficult to create an overall design that is not repetitive, dull, and boring. Very difficult. How do you circumvent this? You circumvent it by many different architectural adjustments, but also by creating diversity and variety, which you can appreciate through movement. Again, this theatrical impact of Adam's sources. And in fact, he introduced a series of niches, semicircular niches, circular niches, square niches, etc., especially to accommodate the books of the Duke. This is the library of the Duke. So not only is a Roman columbarium, but remember, in terms of typology of room, is also a library. And so, if all the other rooms are based on citations and sources, also the Long Gallery is completely based on antiquarian publications published, especially in the late 17th century. It's really a great paradox, in a way, that this enormous classicistic effort of Giovanni Pietro Bellori and the Roman Academy in terms of publications and diffusion of classical prototypes, which happened between 1680 and 1695, really flourished almost 100 years later, 70 years later, embraced by a generation who actually refused the late Baroque language, and so they could look back at what had been produced by Bellori and Bartoli before. This is the image of a typical Roman columbarium as produced by Bartoli and then re-engraved by Piranesi. What they did is to step by step structure the old room according to sources on Roman columbaria. This is a beautiful long drawing, it extends until here, of the chimney elevation and the garden elevation of the Long Gallery, colored, so as executed, still preserved at the Soane Museum. I think is one of the most complex and beautiful drawings related to Syon House. And step by step, everything was filled by books, and the niches originally were intended to be filled by statues, vases, urns, etc., etc., everything referring to death and Roman burials. The two great books that will be used for structuring the long gallery at Syon were the two most famous books on Roman tombs, Gli Antichi Sepolcri by Pietro Santibartoli and Bellori, and Le pitture antiche delle grotte di Roma e del sepolcro dei Nasoni. Remember this detail, the Nasoni. These two books actually were filled with beautiful elevations of Roman tombs, details of Roman tombs, etc., etc., and Adam and the Duke literally copied and pasted most of the elements for the elevations of the door bays and the chimney bays, from the genii holding garlands to the sphinxes to the overall designs of niches, etc., etc. What is extraordinary is that also in the opposite wall, this is the garden wall, in all the bays between the windows you would have had Roman urns with funerary symbolism, surmounted by lunettes by Joseph Wilton in a newly invented pace. All of these lunettes are derived from that book on the sepulchre of the Nasoni. The thing is that in the 18th century they thought that this tomb was the tomb of Ovid, of the Nasoni family, Publius Ovidius Nasonus. So in a way, what Adam and the Duke are doing in this room, and this is probably one of the most complex rooms in terms of iconographical consistency ever produced by Adam, what they did is not only to refer to sources related to Roman tombs and columbaria, but also to the source referring to the tomb of Ovid, one of the greatest poets of classical antiquity, whose books were contained in the library, not surprising. So we refer both to the funerary theme of the room and to classical literature. Not surprisingly, all these books, the Bellori Immagini, Gli Antichi Sepolcri, I Sepolcri dei Nasoni, were all contained, this is the inventory of 1786, were all contained within the library. So the library columbarium is an extremely sophisticated space which contains in itself the sources of its own decoration and its own logic. So it's a sort of meta room in a way. What is extremely spectacular about this room, and in fact I'm sure that because of its iconographical complexity, I'm sure that behind this room Thomas Percy, the famous author of the Ballads of the Borders, who was the tutor of the sons of the couple, I think that being a great antiquarian, there's his mind behind this room. Not only everything then is devoted to Roman columbaria and classical literature, but we have a final element which speaks about oblivion and the past. This room here leads towards the garden, and this door is a library. It looks like a library, a bookcase, but actually is a door, so it's a sham library, opens up and leads you towards the garden. So what you have here, you have just the spines of books, but no books. It's purely decorative in the name of consistency. So what you have there, and we still have the inventory, is a Biblioteca of Libri Deperditi, and they list it. So a library of the great lost book of classical antiquity. Because it's a fake library, because it's a sham library, and because it's a library that is devoted, and a room devoted to loss, oblivion, and death, they listed here from the Oracula Delphica to Varro Annales, to Xenophont, to Sallustius, etc., etc., great books that had been lost since classical antiquity. So you see, the level of antiquarian awareness and complexity in this room is really brought to an extraordinary level that usually is not associated with Robert Adam in this sense. So this is really a room that speaks about loss, oblivion, and here, if you can see, there are painted roundels of the ancestors of the Duke and the Duchess going back to Charlemagne. So in the room devoted to Roman tombs, you celebrate your dead ancestors. So it's really a funerary, extravagant creation. Also quoting the traditional typology of the long gallery where you would have displayed portraits of the ancestors. So it's very complex in a way. So this room that usually is celebrated as a room where a lady can withdraw after dinner, usually celebrated for its grace and light touch, is actually a room which is all structured around the concept of death, loss, and oblivion. One of the many typologies working on the triple level of citation that we see at Syon House. The language of Adam then, through his Works in Architecture, published in 1773, the first volume in 1773, and then other followed, will spread all over Europe. This is the first language that then will become a common shared architectural language from St. Petersburg to Rome. So there's a phenomenon, it goes back to the source. So we have Adamesque interiors in Faenza, in Parma, in Milan, in Rome, in Palermo, etc., etc. And truly, this is what I think is one of the most important moments in English architecture, because if usually British architecture is highly eccentric and based on importation from the continent, in this case is the first great language that actually goes the other way around, crosses the channel to influence the arts of the continent. So Adam, just to conclude, who very often is considered to be a great ornamental decorator, yes, he is a great decorator. His architecture is mainly a pictorial, especially the interiors. The exteriors are, of course, different, but the interiors are pictorial, sensorial. But he could also be a very skilled and highly intellectual assembler, providing something that an educated and well-cultivated patron would have asked. So iconographical consistency is also something that Adam could provide to the dilettanti, the antiquaries, and great Georgian patrons. Thank you.